Text questions come in from Gary in Suffolk. Why are the water companies allowed to function without competition? Surely the idea of privatisation is exactly to bring about competition. The UK water companies are taking us for fools, milking customers to pay shareholders and the boardroom vast sums of money whilst avoiding at all costs any investment. It's a national scandal and should be stopped. Just to give you a little bit of background here, water companies are asking customers to potentially, they're saying that they might increase bills by up to 40% to fund the cost of repairs to sewers in order to end the dumping of sewage in our rivers and seas. Meanwhile, Thames Water could be about to collapse, so we read in the papers anyway, because of the scale of its debts. Peter Hitchens.
Well, it's, I think, quite clear now that some things should be run by the state and some things should be run privately, and that water companies should never have been privatised and should always have been run by the state. The same, I would say, is very much true of the railways, and there are probably several other things that, if we could discuss this, we could come up with the same answer. I think the case for general privatisation, the dogma of privatisation, has been destroyed in the past 20 years, and the water companies and what's happened to them is probably the strongest example of that argument and the best experience we shall have. It has to be done. It's going to be very expensive. The damage that's been done by these privatisations will have to be reversed by them being taken again into proper, efficient, thoughtful state ownership of the kind that I say that British Rail exemplified before it was torn to pieces by a mad, dogmatic experiment.
Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, this was a fraud committed against the British people for the last 40 years, unfortunately, and now we're seeing it collapse. The water companies hiked prices 40% after privatisation. They failed to invest in the infrastructure that they got on the cheap. They sold off some of the assets, the reservoirs for housing development and so on, which is why we haven't got the capacity now to expand as the population's grown. And they've loaded the companies with debts. They've basically asset stripped the companies. So we talk about the cost of taking it back into public ownership. Thames Water's worth nothing. It's got debt.
But what makes you say that they've asset stripped? What makes you say that they've asset stripped the companies? You could argue that they haven't invested enough, but what have they stripped?
They have loaded the companies with debt, yet paying out £3.2 billion worth of dividends to their shareholders in the past 20 years. Right, so they've taken on debt, they're in massive debt, and they've handed out money to private shareholders without investing in the infrastructure whilst jacking up our bills.
Isn't that it's theft? Andrew, isn't that the fault of the regulator?
But that was what was designed. This was built in. If you'd regulated them properly, and I hear people saying, oh, we can regulate them better and fine them more. They're bankrupt. What are you going to fine? Yeah. You need to take if you fine the other water companies more sternly for pouring sewage into our rivers and seas, they're all going to collapse as well.
It's like the privatised railway companies just walk away when they run into trouble.
Let me bring in Nicky.
Well, look, we just had a debate about paying for the repair of school buildings, and we've talked about other investment that's needed. And now suddenly the state is suddenly going to be able to take back the water companies and perhaps the railways and everything else, and put in money and everything else. All you have is a tremendous demand. So the DEFRA, where Jim aspires to be Secretary of State, people beating upon the door continuously, saying, can I have investment for this? Can I have investment for that? And this demand, everything else. I'm not going to say there aren't issues, that there are when things are privatised, the structure that's used, the failure of the regulators and others. But I think if you compared what the likely investment would have been under state ownership and what it has been, it's significantly higher under privatisation. But yes, in terms of money paid out to shareholders, investment that is required, poor regulation, not necessarily the right management. But we are talking about, obviously, the focus on Thames Water. There are a number of water companies, many of whom are run in a far, far better, more sustainable way.
Do you not think that one of the fundamental planks of a Tory government, though, is to allow a return to shareholders? I mean, what is a reasonable return? Because obviously, if you're going to attract investment into the sector, you're going to have to allow shareholders to earn some level of return.
Well, but that's for the whole point about, if you believe in capitalism, if you believe in companies, the board has to decide that in terms of what the money you keep in the company for future investment and what is it you pay out to the shareholders to encourage them to carry on to
it's not capitalism, is it, though? Because it's a natural monopoly.
Exactly.
I can't have another water pipe put into my...
That's where regulation comes in.
Well, that's work. You could then say, well, actually, you should follow the electricity model, where actually we do have a choice about which electricity companies we're going to go to.
That's been a notable success as well, hasn't it?
But this is more the infrastructure.
This is about infrastructure and investment.
Jim?
Well, I think we're all looking at the water industry, and there is, I think, agreement from most people that what happened on privatisation was a national scandal. The company was handed over at a song. They were handed over with no debt whatsoever. And with plenty of assets. And what we've seen is, as Andrew has said, those assets have been stripped away. We've now at debt levels of £60 billion. At the same time, dividends of £72 billion has gone out. The money was not in the system. It's essentially been taken with one hand and piled on with debt in the other. Now, the question comes, well, given where we are, so if there's an agreement that we shouldn't have done it in the first place, well, I'm afraid that is not the world we're in today. The world we're in today is that we have a privatised water industry in England, and of course it's not for profit in Wales, but in England, and we have to reconcile some of that. And it's complicated. I'm not saying that as an excuse, but it's a reality that there are significant pension fund holders who are investors in water in England. For instance, there are 4 million UK pension fund holders who are investors, including the Mine Workers Pension Scheme, the University Superannuation Scheme, the BT Scheme, the Tesco Employee Scheme, of people who've invested to get a decent pension into old age. There are also some people who took on privatisation, share options as employees of water companies, the workers. And so it is a bit more complicated. But it's a matter of fact that there is a lot of our shareholdings of English water. There are essentially foreign sovereign...
But what's wrong with that? I mean, as long as you've got the right to veto, if you feel that a foreign hostile government could have your national assets. But if you're talking about Canadian pension funds, what's the problem?
Because in the end, where's that money coming from that pays them what their expectation in terms of a dividend return on one hand, when we have such a gulf in terms of investment required to reduce leakage so we don't have water shortages? And also we need to talk about the sewage scandal. There's over 800 sewage discharges taking place every single day, polluting our rivers, our lakes and our seas. And it's a place of where we live. Literally the beaches where children build sandcastles are having raw human sewage pumped into them.
These are national strategic assets.
I'll come back to you in a second, Peter.
But that gives us a point about, it's been a failure of regulation, a failure of demands. There are other industries where the regulator makes it very clear how they expect that industry to perform, to behave, to look after the assets and the level of return to shareholders. We saw at the beginning of the pandemic, for example, where the Bank of England stepped in and said the banks are not going to pay out dividends to shareholders. They're going to do the right thing by their customers. And I think you'd argue that by and large that's what happened.
But that's basically Labour's plan. So
Peter, you wanted to come back.
Nicky, remind me when it was that the water industry was privatised?
1980s.
Exactly. Well, it seems to me to have been an awful lot of both Conservative and Labour governments since then. And if the regulation was no good, couldn't they have noticed and done something about it? The truth was nobody cared and nothing was done. And we now have a national strategic asset. In fact, the water supply to the capital city of this country and its most productive and most densely populated area is now under the control of a body which, as far as I understand, is on the verge of bankruptcy. And that is not tolerable in a civilised country. And we're going to have to do something about it, whatever it costs. I don't believe in nationalisation without compensation. If there are shareholders, they have to be compensated. That's part of the cost, and part of the cost which has to be blamed on the people who failed.
Jim, you want to come back? I want to ask you, Jim. Would you nationalise? But to the point,
it's a matter of having to do it.
To the point,
it haven't any choice. We have to do something.
But to the point on nationalisation, would Labour government nationalise?
And this is a point. I mean, I can very easily make a case for nationalisation, but I think as a point of principle, when it comes, Peter, to your point about compensation for shareholders, as a point of principle, as a working person paying my tax, I don't want to pay twice. I don't want to pay into the system that's taken £72 billion out of the system and then pay them again for walking away when the investment's needed to put it right. They've taken the money, and through regulation and government, they should be made to put it right. Now, if they decide to walk away, then that's for them, but we should not be paying them twice.
Okay, so
the people responsible have walked away already.
Okay, so you made it clear you're not. You heard it here first on Cross Question. Jim McMahon is saying
bill payers will not pay twice under Labour government for a
not going to nationalise the water.
The shareholders will be made to put it right.